Hey guys, Logan and Goose here from Popular Woodworking Magazine. So a new addition to the shop here was this Harvey Alpha bandsaw. So I figured I'd take the opportunity not only to show you a few of the features on this new bandsaw, but also show you how I set up a bandsaw. Because a bandsaw can be a great, accurate tool in your shop if it's set up properly. So let's start off by kind of looking at some of the specs on this bandsaw, just because when you look at bandsaws, there are a bunch of different specs available. And they can get a little confusing, especially if this is your first bandsaw purchase. So this Harvey Alpha is a 3 horsepower, 15-inch bandsaw. And when I say 15-inch or any bandsaw sizing, that is the diameter of the wheel. So this is a 15-inch diameter wheel. And this Alpha has a resaw capacity here between the table and this guide in the top position of about 14 inches, which that's a lot of resaw capacity. That's quite honestly more than I want to resaw most of the time, but there is a lot of capacity there. And looking at kind of the overall form of this saw, we have kind of standard power controls over here on the side. There is a keyed on-off switch, which is nice. If I have students here in the shop that don't know how to use the bandsaw, I can quite honestly just shut it off and take the keys and they can't turn it on. So that's a nice feature. The fence system, now I did a video probably about a year ago on the Harvey Big Eye Rip fence. Harvey knows how to make a fence. So it's no surprise that this guy here is a really, really well-designed and well-made fence. Now, stepping down to the surface of the table, this is a little different, and this is actually a new design by Harvey, and this is, I think, a design that they're putting on a lot of their new tools, is this nickel plated table. Now this is a lot shinier than like a cast iron table, and there's a reason for that, not necessarily just for looks, even though it does look really cool. It has a high corrosion resistance. So for somebody like me that is doing a lot of turning, cutting a lot of green or wet wood on the bandsaw, having a corrosion resistant table is super nice, because a lot of times I'm roughing out a bowl blank, then I'm running over the lathe to turn that down, and I might leave offcuts or that wet sawdust sitting on the table, and that can cause rust, especially on a cast iron table. So having corrosion resistant table is really nice. And with this being nickel, it is super hard compared to the cast iron. So this actually has a much higher wear resistance than the cast iron itself. So that's something that I think we're probably going to see Harvey continue. I know that they have it on their bandsaws, have it on their table saws, and I think we'll see that continue. Now, one of the other features that I really like about this saw, and if you're looking at a saw, something that you do need to look at is, what's the guide system look like? So on a bandsaw, we have these upper guides and we have lower guides that are right here below the table. And a lot of the functionality of the saw comes down to how well and accurately those guides are set. And this system here on this Harvey is a super easy, and it's truly a toolless guide adjustment. This one has these wing nuts here. I can adjust how close those bearings are to the blade, and we'll talk about that in a minute and how you set those up. And I can adjust the position front to back with just unlocking that little wing nut and then tightening it down. Same thing goes with that thrust bearing in the back behind the blade. That is also toolless. And this is all kind of mirrored on the bottom side underneath the table. Now, going down a little bit further, a lot of the times bandsaws, you can tilt the table. Some of them are simply knobs that you loosen, and then you have to manually adjust the table how you want it. This Alpha has a crank system, so I can crank it to where I want it, so I can really accurately dial in this table angle. And there's actually a pneumatic shock that helps kind of ease that transition and lets you really fine tune it. And then finally, one of my favorite features of any bandsaw, and I didn't know this till I had a saw that had one of these on here, is a foot brake. A foot brake is super nice to have on a bandsaw. Not only does it shut the saw off when you activate it, it also slows this blade down, because this blade will spin for several minutes once the saw is shut off if you don't use the foot brake. So being able to shut the saw off with a foot and stop that blade within a couple seconds is really nice, especially if your hands are tied up holding material on the table after you finish a cut. So when it comes to setting up a bandsaw, the biggest thing, as I mentioned, is to make sure that these bearings are set correctly for the blade and that the blade is riding correctly on the wheels up top. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these bearings and I'm going to remove them away from the blade. I don't want anything coming into contact with that blade right now. I'm going to do that both on those upper bearings and on these lower ones as well, which you won't be able to see this. Okay, so right now that blade has no bearings in contact with it. And I do have the tension up here set correctly for this blade. When I'm setting tension, I like to set it where if I push laterally on that blade, I can move it about 1/4 of an inch before I really start having to push hard. This has a pretty good blade tensioning gauge on it, but we just want enough tension on there that that blade's going to be rigid as you're sawing. Before we do this any further, we'll take the keys out so that guy can't turn on. And now what we're going to do is we are going to adjust the tracking. Now the tracking is done on most bandsaws on the top wheel. And on the back side, there is a knob that usually has a lock nut on it. And as you spin this wheel, you can adjust this back knob, and that's going to move this wheel. It's going to lean it either in or out on the bottom side. And what that's going to do is it's going to force that blade to either walk forward or walk backwards on that wheel. And what I want, ideally, is I want the blade to ride so that the teeth, right behind these teeth, is the gullet, is that little swoop in the teeth. I want that to be in the very center of that wheel. So that means that this blade is actually going to be towards the back edge of this wheel, but I'm supporting really just the teeth, because the teeth are really what matters here. So right now I can see on the top side that that blade is just a little too close to the back of the wheel. I'm a little bit further back than halfway. So I'm going to loosen that to the left, make that blade come forward on that tire a little bit. And right there looks pretty good. Yeah, those teeth are just in front of the center line on that wheel, which means those are supported right on that crown, and that's exactly what we want. So then I will go ahead and tighten that lock knob down. So now that tracking is completely set. So now that the tracking's set, we're going down here to the bearings. And the bearings, on most saws, you're going to have two, one on the left and the right, and then a thrust bearing behind the blade. And you have to think of these bearings like the bumpers at a bowling alley. If you throw the ball down the lane and you go towards a gutter, it bounces that ball back and forth between the two. And that's exactly what these bearings are for. They're not there to guide the blade, they're there to bump it back onto course. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to crank these bearings nice and tight and pinch that blade. First of all, it's going to be noisy. Second of all, it's going to heat the blade up, and it's actually not going to guide the blade at all. What we want is we want the front teeth of this blade to cut a kerf and the back of the blade to follow inside of that kerf. And then if the workpiece down here twists the blade at all or pushes it off course, those bearings will add a little gentle bump to put the blade back on course. So how I set these guys are I start with these side guides. And the goal here is to set them as close as possible to the blade without it touching. Rocking that bearing back and forth until I see that blade just move, and then I back it off ever so slightly. And on this Harvey, I can also pull these side bearings forward and backwards. I want them basically right behind the gullet. I don't want these bearings on the teeth. If they are on the teeth, what's going to happen is you're actually going to squash the set out of the teeth, and then the blade's going to act like it's dull, even though it's not. It just doesn't have any set left, so it's pinching itself. And then I lock those in place. And I'll do the same thing with this back thrust bearing. I will get that as close as I can, just sighting down, seeing daylight behind the blade, and then lock that in place. And then here's a check you can do. You can spin the blade, and in a perfect world, those bearings don't move at all until there's just a hair of tension on the blade one way or the other. And then that will make those bearings move. That tells you that that blade's pretty much free spinning without touching the bearings until there's an outside force on it, which is exactly what we want. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that the guide adjustment mechanism here sometimes can come into play and throw that off a little bit, especially if it's not tightened down, if there's any play in it. This Harvey's nice and tight, so I found that those bearings don't move at all if I tighten this down, but it is something to keep in mind. That looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna do the same thing with these lower bearings, which is a little hard for you guys to see. On a bandsaw fence, we really want to make sure that the fence is square to the table. I'm not terribly concerned about, the squareness of it to the miter slots. I mean, we can adjust all that, and some people do really go through that setup process. In reality, in my mind, the tooth on a bandsaw blade has enough set that this can actually be off square pretty far, and that blade will still track straight. So I'm not terribly concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the squareness of this fence, especially a tall fence like this Harvey, and the table. I want that to be nice and square. So on this fence, we have these little adjustment knobs. A lot of times you'll have some form of nylon bumper or bushing here. There will generally be some form of lock nut on here as well. So we will loosen those guys because there are a couple of things I want to adjust on this. First, I need to bring the top of the fence towards me just a little bit, but I also want to raise this fence up just slightly because it is really touching here, and on this back side, I do have another adjustment back here. I want to lower it a little bit because there is a little gap here that if I was cutting something thin, it could slide under that. So first of all, we're going to adjust these down. That's going to raise this fence up just a little bit. And then this far side is going to adjust the plumb. There we go. Now I'm going to lock those down. I'm going to hold that tight while I adjust those. Now I'm going to point out on this Harvey as well, there is two of them on the front, and that adjusts the slop out of there. So we'll go ahead and adjust those while we're here. Mine as well. And that looks good still. And I'm going to lower this back side just a little bit. Just double check square again. And there we go. Now that fence is squared up to the table, the blade guides are set. So now the only thing we have left to do is test it out and see how it's cutting. Okay, there we go. So that nice thin veneer cut in that hard maple, and that tells me that this is set up really well. And the things that show me that are it's an even thickness the whole way across, the blade marks are very minimal, and there was no pressure while I was making that cut. I didn't feel a whole lot of resistance other than just the blade cutting the wood. So nothing's binding. It's a nice accurate setup on this bandsaw. Now, this setup should be pretty much the same no matter what blade I put on there. I'll just check the bearings every time I switch out blades. This is a 1/2 inch. I have a 3/4 inch resaw blade, as well as a 1/4 inch blade for tighter curves also. But I'll just go ahead and check those bearings every time I change the blade, just to make sure nothing's changed. Following these steps gives you a really nicely cutting saw that's going to be a joy to use in your shop.